Hi, everybody, and welcome back. This is our third and final installment of Racism in America, and we've talked about where the problem started. We've talked about the church's response, and now we're talking about what do we do? Where do we go from here? What can you and I do in that? I'm Kevin Warner. I'm the rector at St. John Divine. My assistant rector, David Wyly, and pastor of South Hills Church, Pastor Zelvis Applin. So welcome back, and guys, I think before we figure out where to go from here, we have to look at what are we responding to? What are the problems that we're pushing back against? And I think obviously one is just how we were raised. What kind of natural things were ingrained in us as kids? I think that I deem that challenge and the challenge of what's going on in society today, some of which are polarization. We seem to be a country that likes to be absolute one way or the other. We have the upcoming elections, which makes everybody hesitant to do anything because you don't want to, you know, and so and then how the media frames the dialogue is a problem. Um, the issues get a little muddied, and they're going to make it as polarizing as possible because that's what sells. You'll tune in if it's them against them, and this whole us and them culture that seems to have sprung up because that's what keeps viewership and sales of magazines and newspapers going. And what else? And maybe respond to that.
Yeah. So when we talk about the first point that you brought up, our past and our upbringing, a lot of us are a product of culture versus nature. It's nurture versus nature. What were you brought up to believe? What were your family's belief system and values? When I look back at a lot of historical documents and also some documentaries that I watch, man, I'll see when Jim Crow was in effect and you have slavery and different things of that nature. And we got to remember that the civil rights legislation didn't get passed until, golly, in the 60s. And we're not that far removed from that. We're talking about, in terms of a biblical understanding, we're only a generation away from when the civil rights legislation got passed. And so when you think about the issues that were prevalent in that time period leading up to that moment, and even after that, a lot of families believed in segregation. A lot of families had struggles with racism, and there was still a lot of injustices that were occurring. And so, a lot of people who may be watching right now may have lived through that, may have been brought up in families that had these types of thought processes towards other people, and maybe viewed a culture of people as inferior to their own culture.
Well, in a perfect example of that, I'm the first generation in my family to grow up outside of segregation.
Correct.
My dad, my mom, they all grew up during a time, they all graduated from high school before integration actually took hold.
That's right, same here.
So my generation as a whole is the first generation to start school in the late 70s and go all the way through in an integrated school system.
Correct.
So, to your point, Zelvis, yeah, we have to. I think one of the things that we have to do is we have to be curious about our past.
That's right.
We have to understand that the things that we learned growing up were probably only part of the story.
Yeah.
And we have to be curious about what the other part of the story is.
Correct.
That we didn't necessarily know.
Correct. And many of us probably grew up in a time period where we just didn't realize something was wrong.
Right.
And now you and I would be a little different from that because of the time period that we grew up in.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of our parents and grandparents, they would have been like, well, this was normal. Like, we didn't see anything wrong with this. This was the way things were. Condoleezza Rice did on Help Me Find My Roots by Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr., who is a Harvard professor. He interviewed and did a discovery of Condoleezza Rice's ancestry.
Mm-hmm.
And she talked about the fact that she grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. And he asked her, what was that like? And she said, normal, because we didn't know any different, right? This is the world that we grew up in. And so for many of you watching today, maybe you're saying, but man, I'm not racist. I don't feel that way. And that could be true, but we've got to be honest enough to say, okay, well, let's take the blinders off, because even Condoleezza Rice had blinders because that was just normal for her. But now, as we are far removed from that, we can see that that type of living is abnormal. That's not right. There was something inherently wrong with the society and the culture that she grew up in. And so do we go back and say, okay, let's be honest about how I grew up and what was taught to me, what type of language was used in my home. Were black people referred to as Negroes, or were they referred to the more derogatory term that you would call somebody who was black back in that time period? Were they thought of as lazy? Were they thought of as rapists? Were they thought of as criminals and murderers? I mean, how was my framework shaped in terms of the black culture?
And I'm going to make kind of a weird point here. Some of us grew up in a colorblind household where it was very integrated, even though I lived in a red line district. But
That's right.
I didn't know about white privilege, and I grew up not understanding. My parents' best friends were black, and we were at their house. They were at our house all the time. Never understood till I got older, and I did a whole sermon on this, that up until I was 9, I didn't know that racism existed, because nobody had told me that it existed.
Yeah.
And it wasn't my experience, and even the media, what I saw on TV, it looked like everybody was getting along. And then when I turned 9, we had the riots in Detroit, and that's when I kind of began to understand, and I was old enough now to learn about the world around me. But I think for a lot of people, they've never taken the time to learn about the world about them.
That's right.
And to look beyond what they assumed was, oh, everything's fine.
Well, I think that in our society today, I think that's a direct result of the opportunity that people have to put themselves in silos. That we can, by choice, narrow our group of friends down on social media to where we only hear the perspectives that we agree with.
That's right. That's right.
We can find media outlets that only address the topics in the manner in which we want to hear them addressed.
Correct.
We can find churches that will only tell us what we want to hear.
That's right.
And
that's right.
Unfortunately, that's not everybody's reality, and we need to be aware of that.
That's right. I saw on Facebook this past week, there was a photo of a friend of mine that put it up on Facebook, and her son was able to see a friend of his that he went to daycare with, and they hadn't seen each other since COVID started, and they got to have a play date. Well, the play date came to an end, and they had to say goodbye to each other. And you see this picture of them embraced and crying because they don't want to leave each other. One kid's black, the other's white. I showed it to my wife, and she just started. It almost brought her to tears, because she saw the innocence of a child's heart that doesn't see color. But in the course of a child's upbringing, there becomes these issues and these situations and these circumstances that the child begins to learn certain behavior that, had that child not been through that process, may not have those types of issues in their lives. And so we've got to understand that some of this is our parents doing, our grandparents doing, our great-grandparents doing. But the good thing about the body of Christ is that does not have to be our reality today. There is a way forward, and we'll talk about that. But our past and our upbringings, we talk about polarization, conservative versus liberal and progressive, and there's always this dynamic that is in society that I believe came from even eternity. You had God's agenda, and you had Satan's agenda. Satan's agenda polarized heaven itself. The Bible tells us that a third of the angels got kicked out of heaven with Satan himself, because he wanted to do something opposite of what would have been pleasing to God. And so we saw polarization in heaven to where we now have the demonic realm, which is just falling angels, and we have the heavenly realm where God's angels still reside. And so that polarization has even found its way and infiltrated the earth, and we have just this dichotomy that continues to exist even in our political system.
Right, and I think, the failure of the political system is it is two parties.
That's
So
what it
there's
is.
this or that.
Yeah.
And there's no, and reality is full of nuance.
That's right. That's right.
And you look at God's creation and just the number of different species of butterfly
Correct.
and all the great diversity that is out there. It's more than this or that. It's many answers, many nuances.
Correct.
And I think, obviously we talked about it before we started this. One of the things about the media is they're going to do what's going to sell.
That's right.
And simplifying things, dumbing everything down to this or that. You're on this side or that side, and letting them frame the dialogue.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the things that I remember when Colin Kaepernick took a knee,
Mm-hmm.
and I thought, oh, he's protesting civil rights. Never even occurred to me until the media brought it up.
Yep.
To tie it into the military. He's not against the military.
No.
He's not mad at the troops. He is speaking to a specific issue in society, and he's trying to call attention to it in a peaceful way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And peaceful protest gets him what? Gets him out of a job, and he loses millions of dollars, and he's no longer employable because nobody wants the circus that the media has created.
Correct.
It wasn't so much a Colin created. I mean, Colin made a, and it got reported, but then people started adding things onto it that had nothing to do with what he was trying to do.
That's right.
Which was call attention to systemic racism in America in a peaceful way.
Correct.
And that happened, what, in 2016?
Yeah.
And we see that same system, I guess, of conflation of issues even today. I mean, look no further than the monument debate.
Mm-hmm.
The monument debate started out as people of color pointing out to white people that, look, these have a connotation to me that reminds me of a period of time in history that is painful. Which, yes, but what has happened since then is we have these anti-government protests that have latched on to the monument debate. We have these other conflation of issues that have all surrounded themselves around monuments. Now you're faced with a choice in society. You're either for the destruction of monuments or you're against it.
Yeah.
And it's a false choice.
Yeah.
Because we have to pay attention to the issues that are associated with it.
Correct. Correct. It's so funny, when you bring up the monument issue, I think it brings me to a greater point is that we just gotta use common sense sometimes. We've gotta use our brains. Let's go back to Germany, okay? We know Germany went through a very dark period in their history. It's called the Nazi period. It was the reign of Hitler and the Nazi Party. And in Germany today, they really distanced themselves from that ideology, that philosophy, that very destructive agenda that almost destroyed the world, if we really think about it. And so they have taken down all the symbols of Nazi Germany. They don't celebrate Hitler. You don't see monuments of him everywhere in Germany because they see that as a evil that happened at one point in their world where a great charismatic leader almost led a country to complete collapse and ruin. And so in America, we have these monuments, we have these symbols, even in flags, that are very offensive to an oppressed culture. But here's what we do. Well, that's part of our history. Well, Hitler was a part of Germany's history. But you may find him in a museum over there, but you're not going to find a big statue out in public about him, and you're not going to see a bunch of Nazi flags waving around in the country. And so, to me, it's just, if we know that it's wrong to do that in Germany, If we know that's an issue for the German people, then why do we have such a hard time understanding that that could be a really big issue for Americans
Right.
who were from a culture of oppression, and also Americans who may not have been the culture that was oppressed, but may have been the oppressors, but have said that's an evil and that's wrong, and we should not continue to put before a people group as who have been, disproportionately harmed, and we should honor them. I think sometimes we don't think common sense.
Well, and I didn't specifically mean just Confederate monuments.
Yeah.
What I was referring to specifically was monuments to Abraham Lincoln and to Frederick Douglass,
Yeah.
and to some of these other emancipators that we can point to throughout history, where that particular movement has conflated all of the issues and said we need to tear them all down.
Yeah.
So again, that just points out that there's more facets to these conversations than just a simple one side or the other.
Correct. Now, and the problem is that the majority of the attention that is given to monuments tends to be the Confederate monuments.
Right.
You do hear about the Frederick Douglass and the Abraham Lincoln, and,
Right.
and then you hear about the arguments from some statements that people don't even realize Abraham Lincoln made himself about slavery and
Right.
about the black culture that was very derogatory. So you don't know that stuff in history. A lot of people don't know that. And so when you start talking about Abraham Lincoln, oh, you're taking it too far. Well, there's
Right.
two sides to every story. And so I think our ability to reason and our ability to think, will help move us forward in this issue if we can bring down those walls. And then you mentioned the election time. I mean, guys, everything is grossly exaggerated right now simply because we're in an election cycle. And if you don't believe that whatever news station you're watching does not have an agenda to keep their candidate in office or to vote in their candidate into office, then you really don't understand how the process works and the system works and how these news outlets work. And so there is an agenda right now that is even bigger than what we're seeing, but it's found its way into all the issues that we're facing today. And basically people are trying to get their candidate in office. Why? Because there are seats on the Supreme Court that are up for grabs. There could be one before the election happens, and there could be quite a few after the election happens, and that will tilt the balance of power, and it will influence decisions that will last for generations. And so that's the greater issue that's at stake right now, but everything is getting dogpiled by this main issue, and that is we're in an election year.
So I guess the question then becomes, knowing that these are the challenges, knowing that, we don't know all of our history, or we haven't looked into all of our history, how do we move forward? What is required of us to move forward?
We've got to know the enemy. It's plain and simple. We have got to know the enemy. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12 tells us that our struggle is not against one another. I'll say this matter of factly. If you have a skin issue, you have a sin issue. It is what it is. And the reality is, you're not my enemy. You're not my enemy. I'm not your enemy. The enemy is the enemy. And he has a name. His name is Satan, or Lucifer, or Beelzebub, whatever you want to call him. But he is the real enemy of our soul. And the Bible tells us that we don't struggle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, the authorities, the wickedness, the spiritual wickedness in the heavenly places. So we are at war against an enemy that hates our guts and really wants to destroy us and wipe us off the face of the earth.
And he's not going to do it. He's going to put hate in our hearts, so we do it to each other.
That's exactly right.
And that's the thing that, if we're going to make a response to systemic racism, it has to come from a place that is led by the Spirit.
That's right.
It's got to come from the good news and the gospel that every one of us, going back to one of the things we said in the very first, the image of God that is in each of us.
Imago Dei. Yeah.
Imago Dei.
Yeah.
It has to be the starting place, because if you don't see the other as made in the image of God and deserving of what everything that means,
Yeah.
then Satan has won a victory in your soul.
Yeah.
That now needs to be dealt with, confessed, brought out.
That's right.
And, so what should the church's response be? Where do we go from here? It should be from a place that you know who God is, who you are in God, and then who everybody else is.
That's right. That's right. We talked about what the Bible has to say about what the great commandment is and how that ties into how we view one another. Speak on that a little bit, because that was really important for us to even have the framework to speak to our audience today. So, what does the Bible have to say about what's important to God?
Jesus gives us the recipe for this in Matthew chapter 26. He gets asked the question, "Teacher, what is the greatest of all the laws?"
Yeah.
And Jesus tells us in that gospel that you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your soul. And the second commandment is like unto it.
Mm-hmm.
Love your neighbor as you love God.
That's right.
So when we see the Imago Dei in our brothers and sisters, and we dedicate ourselves to following the teachings of Christ, and we do those things that Jesus says is important, that's when we recognize God in each other.
That's right.
That's when we listen to one another.
That's right.
And I think that's one of the biggest things that I want to see society get to a point where we can do. As a church, as a society, as a people, we need to see the image of God, and we need to listen.
Yeah.
Because like Father Kevin said in his sermon, we don't know what we don't know.
That's right.
And if we don't look for the image of God, and we don't love our neighbors as ourselves, then we don't have a chance of moving forward.
Yeah, and the Apostle John said, if you say you hate your brother, whom you see every day, and you say that you love God, whom you have never seen, you are a liar. And so one of the things that we've got to understand is we have got to really evaluate our hearts. Because there's no way we could say we love God. We've never seen him. And despise our brother whom we see every day. The truth is not in us. And so we've got to be accountable to the word of God. And then Jesus said this beautifully. He said, when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was in prison, you came and saw me. And they were like, wait a minute.
When
What are you talking about?
When have we done
When did
this?
that happen?
Right.
And he said, when you have done this to the least of these, you have done it to me. And here's what I would say to people. If you can't see me as your brother, at least see me as the least of these. If you can't do it because, man, I just, that guy's just different, he's not my brother. All right? I think you're wrong, but I'll give it to you. At least see me as the least of these.
And I think as Christians, it is our responsibility when we hear the kind of polarizing rhetoric, the people are changing the narrative to suit themselves.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And their prejudices. And, we don't want to look at why somebody's taking a knee, because it will change things for us.
Yes, it would.
And I don't want
So
change.
good, man.
So much in life is changing. The last place we want change is in the church, and certainly we don't want to hear our leaders talking about it in church. We just want things the way they've always been, and that can't be.
That cannot be.
That cannot be.
Yeah.
And it may be that what is required is for people to first off recognize that they have the privilege.
That's right.
And then be willing to give up.
That's so good.
And that's hard.
That is hard.
That's hard because, I've enjoyed something all my life. Most of it I didn't even know that I had it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I find out later on, I've had this. And again, David made a reference to a sermon. I really feel like if you get a chance to go to the website and look at that sermon, If One of Us Can't Breathe, where we don't have time to really cover all that today, but it's in there. But we have to be willing to look at what is true. Not what we think is true, but what is true. And be curious enough to ask the questions and then deal with the answers we get.
That's right. And to speak into that, the one thing that we've got to get better at is listening. You know, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. He wants us to listen more than we speak. And something that can be helpful in the dialogue that we're having in terms of in our own homes and stuff of that nature. You know, I've had a lot of people approach me and say, brother, help me understand what I don't understand. I'm not an African American. I don't understand what it's like to be from your culture and to live through what you guys have lived through. Help me to understand. And I'm like, great. I'm glad you want to do that. And oftentimes I've been in conversations where it's been just that. They just come to the table and they just want to listen, and they're asking the right questions to get greater understanding. But there have been those interactions that I've had where people are trying to defend their position. And I'm like, wait a minute now. You're not the one who's been living through this. You're not the one who's been oppressed for over 400 years.
Yeah. Tell us about your situation, but oh, wait a minute, I don't agree with that.
Yeah.
Well, you know, it's your situation. It's not your situation.
Yeah.
And yeah.
It's my reality and not your
Well, yeah.
reality. So the point is not to go tit for tat and to one up each other. The point is, I'm just simply giving you information. Do with it what you choose to do.
Yeah.
I'll tell you I think as a white person, I think one of the things that we need to be mindful of, though, is not going to our black brothers and sisters and saying, tell me everything I need to know.
Mm-hmm.
Do the work. We have to do the work.
Yes.
We have to read.
Watch
we have
the
to
videos.
watch the
You don't want to
documentaries,
see.
watch the
Yeah,
videos.
yeah.
You know, we have to be willing to
Mm-hmm.
do some of the work before we go to our friends of color and say, okay, what is it I don't know? Because that's easy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that puts the burden on people of color to explain the oppression that they have experienced throughout their lives. And that's not fair.
Yeah.
We as people of white people, we need to do the work on our own.
Correct.
And supplement that with conversations, and we need to listen.
And what's made this conversation easy is the fact that this is not something the two of you have just woke up one day and said, oh my gosh, I got to learn about, oh man, what's going on in America. What, you know, before this even became an issue, we were already having conversations like this. I mean, we've been having this conversation for years. Yeah. And then David comes in, and I mean, he's just a wealth of knowledge, and he has so much historical context. He's like a walking history book.
Yep.
And so, you know, when we sit down and talk, I don't have to over-explain anything, because there's a certain level of understanding that you guys already bring to the table, and it helps move the dialogue forward, which I greatly appreciate, because it's been a much easier conversation to have than people who are like, I don't get it, I don't understand it, that's not true, and I'm like, I don't even know why we're here talking then. So, you know, so thank you for your willingness to be involved and engaged in the culture that we lived in. And that really is the attitude of Jesus. When he came, he was a champion of culture. He understood culture, and he engaged in the culture. And it's what made him the greatest leader to ever live, other than the fact that he's God himself.
Oh, yeah.
You know? And he created leadership.
Right.
But
That kind of helps.
Amazing. Absolutely.
Well, guys, it's been great. I think this has been good. Hopefully, it'll be of use to others. And I think, David, it's your turn to close us out in prayer.
Amen.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Let us pray. Gracious, loving, and almighty God, we give you thanks for the blessings of this life. We thank you for the opportunity to come together and learn more about your creation and the people that you created. You fashioned us many people, but brought us together in the love of Jesus Christ. Bring us together now as we take on difficult conversations. Be with us, be in our hearts and on our lips, as we endeavor to turn toward you and turn away from sin. All this we ask in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.